You're listening to part 14 of The Wintermaker, read by author Jason Lee Willis. Chapter 61, Come Hell or High Water. Split Rock, Minnesota, March 20th, 1962. Albert Fisher knew something was wrong, but he ignored it. With hands on the edge of the flume, he put one foot in front of another and kept moving. I believe in Lily. I believe in the future. I know what needs to be done. Do you hear that? Chris stopped, whispering. I hear something. There was nothing around them except the treetops along the slope of Bleeding Rock. Even so, he took a break to catch his breath. Chris stared off into the woods. Do you have the dream catcher? Albert asked. No, I left it back in the car. Why? You might be hearing something that's not happening now. It could be echoes from the past or whispers from the future. This sounded like a woman singing, Chris explained. We need to get to the sawmill, Albert said. Keep moving. They'd gone no more than another 10 yards when Albert caught sight of a fire through the trees. He reached forward, taking Chris by the shoulder. 30 yards ahead, on the top of the bluff, a small fire burned on the flat stone of Bleeding Rock. A woman's voice found its way through the trees. Stay low and keep moving, Albert said. Who are they? Trouble. At the 30-yard mark, the flume cut behind Bleeding Rock. Several pines and the rim of the flume shielded them from view, but the details of the scene became quite clear. The singer was wrapped in blankets, including one over her head, yet long strands of red hair came down over her shoulders and head and chest. She was young and beautiful. Albert gasped when he saw the body of a young boy, naked and pale upon the rocks. His blood shimmered in the grooves. Chris ducked down so quickly that he knocked the side of the flume. Albert lowered himself too. It's the man in the red Thunderbird, Chris said. The driver, not the guy in the white suit. The singing stopped. What is it? The man in the derby hat asked. Spies, the woman said. It's one of Odin's spies. Should I shoot it? No, the woman answered. We don't want to be found until the ritual is complete. We need to finish the song. Throw a rock at it. It? A moment later, Albert understood when an angry raven quirked after a rock bounced off a tree and rattled to the ground. Odin spies, the ravens. Keep moving, Chris, Albert whispered, quietly. Chris listened, and soon the two passed away from the campfire. In his mind, he compared the dead boy to all those he knew. He didn't recognize the boy, but that didn't take away from the horror of what they'd discovered. He peeked back, and in the slivers of light, he saw the man pacing the perimeter of the fire with a pistol in hand. That's not my fight, Albert decided and continued ahead. Even if he'd had 2 six-shooters on his hip, it was almost impossible to get down from the flume. The most he could do was throw twigs at the two villains. A few minutes later, a strange sound filled the air. A siren. Hurry, Chris, I don't think we have much time left. The distance between the ground and the chute almost became level, providing an opportunity to exit. A bit farther, Bleeding Rock dropped down from the flat parking lot of the boat landing. Chris turned and asked, Should we get out here? No, the flume leads right to the top floor of the sawmill. In the distance, a strange rumble filled the air. What is that? Chris asked. Death is coming. A siren from Split Rock Water Tower filled the air. Grandpa, I'm kind of scared. Yeah, me too, Chris, me too. In the distance, the 3-story sawmill waited. Beneath them, Bleeding Rock dropped to the flat parking lot of the boat landing. Albert saw a brand-new green Renault Dauphine parked in the deep shadow below the bluff. He turned back to the distant fire, but no light could be seen. If monsters were waiting in ambush, he honestly couldn't think of a more horrifying place to confront them. An old building with faded red paint filled with gigantic blades capable of ripping the largest trees into pieces, waited just 100 yards ahead of him. A nightmare from my childhood. They pressed on. At the mouth of the flume, they paused, looking first toward the lake and then down to the flowing waters of Split Rock Creek. Albert took out his flashlight and inspected the scene. The mill itself was built astride Split Rock Creek, like a giant straddling the creek. The old paddle wheel could carry water all the way up to the third floor for the log flume, and provided enough power to move all the belts in the building. Once the water passed through the building, it would empty into the narrow channel of the creek. A small dam at the base of the western wall kept the water backed up into the bay of Lake Manitou, allowing the water to enter Split Rock at the will of a man. With Steve Knutson, the sawmill manager at the hospital with his surviving daughter, the task fell to them to save Nicky Guerin and Gavin McPherson. Chris boldly stepped through the doorway. Albert followed. The rectangular room held little warmth. It possessed a desolate quality with everything covered in a coating of dust. The top floor had been preserved with the thought of turning it into some sort of museum. Saw blades as tall as Chris stood in the middle of the room, and after 24 tentative steps, Albert reached the stairway to the second floor. There he found a light switch and naked bulbs flooded the room. They stood, basking in the artificial light that seemed to shield like a shield against anything paranormal. Albert exhaled and walked to the stairs. He finally reached the ground floor, where the big wheel once reached in the deep channel of Split Rock Creek. A solid wooden floor had been built as a platform over the rock face, but alongside the wheel, the open wound allowed access to both rock and water. Albert turned on the lights. It shouldn't be this easy. At the end of the room, he could see the large garage doors that allowed lumber trucks to pull up to the saw room. Instead of water chutes, a room now held gears, chains, pulleys, and levers. With a fixed jaw, Albert marched forward and turned the deadbolt on the exterior door, opening it to the dark. A spray of water splashed him, pushing him backward in the doorway and slamming the door closed. "Are you okay?" Albert felt a trickle of blood from his nose. "Damn blood thinners. I'll be fine," he said, kicking the door open. The water along the shore was already rising. "We don't have much time. We need to open the pond gates. If the water rises any higher, it will let the Tok Pai reach the Guerin family." Chris nodded. "If we don't open the gates, the pressure will build until it bursts and sweeps away half of Split Rock," Albert assessed. He didn't fear for himself, but he did fear for Chris and the others. "I'm glad I have your help. I probably couldn't do it by myself. Let's go, Chris." They walked around to the front of the sawmill, which faced Lake Manitou. The logging dam had been built of cement 70 years earlier. The bedrock that descended from the bleeding rock outcrop met the water's edge, where blasting had created a foothold. In this foothold, a 15-foot wall rose from the edge of the water, with two tiered footings on both sides of the creek holding back the metal gates. When all metal gates were dropped into place, the water level on the lake could rise up 10 feet from its natural level. In the 1890s, the dam created a large lagoon in front of the mill, where logs could be wrangled right up to the saw. To protect his house and lumber yard, his son-in-law had lowered 9 of the 10 gates into position, shifting the outlet to distant Canaranzi Creek. Even with the final uppermost gate open, if the pressure wasn't released, the flood would rip out the entire dam, and a 10-foot wall of water would destroy Split Rock. "Hang on, everybody. Help has arrived." "So how does this work?" Chris asked as they walked up the arms of the dam towards its gate. "There are pins on this side that need to be inserted, and then the wheel winch on the other side lifts them out of the water." Albert clutched his left arm as sudden pain gripped him, and he leaned back against the metal rails to catch his breath. "Are you okay?" Chris asked. "We're doing this, come hell or high water," he nodded. "Why don't you just insert the pins and tell me when to start cranking?" Chris offered. Albert patted him on the shoulder. "Go wait on the other side. I'll try not to fall into the water again." He watched Chris walk across the platform. Albert glanced to the rising waters of the lake and then to the angry waters of Split Rock. He turned to see Chris. He turned back to see Chris found the large metal wheel. "Wait until I've inserted the pin," Albert called, standing on a metal platform along the creek side of the dam. Now give me some slack. Chris reversed the wheel and Albert pushed the pins through. Okay, now crank it slowly. It's only 12 inches, but there are millions of gallons of water behind these gates. Are you ready? Ready as ever. Chris turned the wheel, and for a moment the water grew silent as the metal gate rose to block the water that passed over it. But as it lifted, the water simply went under the gate, spraying out like a fireman's hose 20 yards toward the creek. The pressure was so unexpected that Albert had to take a few steps backwards. Keep cranking slowly. Chris gave another crank, and the volume grew exponentially louder. Albert tried to picture all the flooded houses along the lake, especially the Guerin house where Nicky lived. Each inch of the thick metal gate was lifted would cause the lake to drop an inch proportionally. Though the volume of the creek was now deafening, the 9th gate joined the 10th gate, high above the span of the dam. Chris walked across the dam, motioning for Albert. This time, the lake itself folded into a 20-foot V as water pulled the surface of the lake towards them. "It's so loud," Chris said, laughing a bit. "To be young again," Albert envied. "I'll use my flashlight to signal when to begin," Albert shouted over the roar. "We've got 3 more feet to go to save folks. It's going to get a lot louder. Are you ready?" Albert knew that dropping 5 feet from the lake and adding it to the river would easily top the sandbag dike back at the lumber yard and house. But the water would funnel through split rock like nature intended, instead of all 10 feet bursting through at once. "Will you be safe where you're standing?" "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." Chris went over to the other side of the dam and manned the wheel again. Once the pin was inserted, Albert flickered the flashlight and then repeated the process, adding the 3rd metal gate above the dam. With 2 feet opened, the water formed a torrent that shot out about 15 yards before dropping into the channel, whose rock walls could barely contain it. It splashed and frothed out of its bed, and 2 feet of lake water rushed into the small gap. Chris returned back across the metal bridge, putting his hands on the posts of the safety chains as he passed. "I don't think it's safe to open the other 2. We should wait." Why do my teeth suddenly hurt? Am I clenching my jaw? The pain in his left arm grew worse. "If we wait any longer, it will be too late," Albert said, putting his hand to his chest. "Are you okay?" Albert wiped his face, but the spots he saw were not water spray. Then a cramp began in his chest that felt like a growing fire spreading. He rubbed at the spot as if that would make it go away. "Not now. I'm not done yet." He flickered the button of the flashlight at Chris. "One more and then I'll take a break." The chains rattled, and Albert slammed a pin into place. Must just be a muscle cramp. I feel better." But his fingers grew numb, and instead of signaling Chris, the flashlight fell from his grasp and onto the ground, illuminating the loading area and parking lot. Chris. 2 gray figures fell from the sky, sliding to a dusty stop. At first, they seemed confused, looking around at their new surroundings. They faced the lake, growling defensively. Then they turned around, noticing both him and Chris. "They found us," Albert realized. He remembered advice Lily had given him 2 decades earlier. The Takpai could not cross the threshold of the river. "Stay on the other side of the dam. Go, Chris." Albert took a step up to stand between the sawmill and the creatures, only to fall forward onto his face. No strength, no weapon. This is not how I wanted to die. The Takpai advanced, but whatever their plans, it didn't really matter to Albert, who chuckled at their attempts to intimidate him. It's time. Chapter 62. Omodai. Old Copper Road, March 20th, 1962. Lily Guerin understood her mistake the moment she placed her bare hands upon the stone and sang the first syllable. Time froze. The magic trapped within the large white egg poured over them. Her intention had been to use it as a weapon, to once again defeat the evil Takpai woken by death magic. Instead, the magic opened doors to the future and past, threatening to drive Lily insane. Focus on saving the children. Without the children, there is no future. Beside her, brave Wally Crane stood upon the old stage on Carousel Island. With his fishing boat, he'd ferried them to the island to rescue Cameron. Although she and Wally were upon the solid foundation of the old bandstand, the floodwaters were only inches away from sweeping them away. If I die, the loop will be broken. This is what the Wintermaker wants. The Wintermaker had betrayed her and now openly attacked her and her family. Her grandson Cameron was stuck in a tree, the branches swaying from his weight. Nicole tried to steady the boat at the base of the tree. Dangling from the broken roller coaster tracks, young Gavin McPherson, future father to the Omadai, risked his life to reach his future brother-in-law. Kill any of those three, and the prophecy shatters. The Takpai must know this. Out on the open water, 2 of the dozen Takpai found valiant Eddie Nielsen, who floated on a small raft toward them. Behind her, somewhere on Bleeding Rock, Lily sensed the greatest danger. A song filled the air, confusing the magic within the Philosopher's Stone, which, now unleashed, listened for instruction. I'll show them who controls the stone. I'll destroy them all for threatening my family and friends. When Lily was a young woman, she placed her hands upon the stone and sang the words from the dawn. Her entire focus had been on Jean, along with McGeesy, and this tunnel vision blinded her from what else she could see. Now, an old woman of 79, she looked past the present. In the past, she could see not only her 16-year-old self, but also Iyipasu, her ancestor that brought the evil stone to an evil place. She saw him as an older man, then as a younger man as he first discovered Lake Manitou. Far beyond that, she saw a woman mourning the death of a beloved father, singing the same words passed down to her. But the future is what distracted her. She could see the intersection of past, present, and future, the place where the loop closed. Levi, the boy in the snakeskin boots, was here. He had visited her on the fateful day at the cave, the day she took hold of the Philosopher's Stone. Now she again watched him, high on the hill, as he found the old willow in Albert Fisher's yard. He collected the willow branches and hastily retreated back to his car. He drove the black car down the hill to a foreign future where brand new houses replaced the sawmill and boat launch. Once again, parked his car, he crept into the ice, walking right to where she waited on Carousel Island. In his hand, he held a single loop of willow. "Happy New Year's," Levi said, a crooked grin on his face. "You're, Lily," she finished. "Well, yeah, but I was gonna say that you're younger. You're old, but you're not like brittle old. You're in trouble, aren't you?" Lily looked around her. "I am. I can see that. That must be the water drum you told me about. What are you doing with it?" "Defending my grandchildren. The Wintermaker broke his promise, and now he will pay the price. I'll rip him from his tomb and cast him into the River of Souls, where he can face his forestalled judgment." "Yeah, about that." Levi slid his hands into his pockets, shivering. "That's what the girl under the willow said you would do." Lily thought of the 2 women from her visions. One was a young girl, blonde and innocent. The other was wounded, a woman with a shattered visage. "Who sent you?" "Well, you did. You told me we needed to close a loop. I did just what you told me to do." He's the one. He's the one who will defeat the Wintermaker. Levi spoke through the window in time created by the loop of willow. "That girl, she told me you were in trouble. She said that if you attack the Tokpai and rip the Wintermaker from his tomb, you will effectively break the loop and shatter the prophecy yourself. No eighth fire, no coming, no second coming, none of it. Poof, gone in an act of revenge. The Wintermaker must be stopped, Lily argued. Looking at the young man's face, she felt as if she was once again debating with her beloved Jean. Yeah, but not by you. Do you see that other witch there on Bleeding Rock? She's trying to change the past. She's connected to someone from the future who's trying to stop the eighth fire from happening. That girl back at the Willow sent Albert to deal with it. You, however, hold the key to the future in your hands. What am I supposed to do? Levi hesitated. The Wintermaker did not betray you. But he did. They killed Jean, and I could heal his body, but I could not pull his soul from the depths. The Wintermaker offered to... Oh, don't hesitate now, Lily. You almost said it. The Wintermaker offered to return the soul of Jean Guerin in exchange for... He knows my dark secret. The Omodai, Lily confessed. As a young woman, it seemed a fair trade for the man she loved. Now, she understood her deal with the devil meant giving the Wintermaker one of her descendants. But only as bait for a trap. Jean, Fawn, McGeesy, and the others were supposed to destroy the Wintermaker as soon as the foul serpent rose from his hole. And that means... Lily wanted to scream in frustration. I had no other choice. I was stuck in a loop. I'd seen the future, and in that future, I had children and grandchildren and... Great-grandchildren, Levi said, gesturing to himself. It wasn't supposed to end like this. If Jean died, none of it could happen, so there was no other choice. I had to make the promise. I had to sacrifice the future in exchange for the present. The Wintermaker returned Jean to me, but for my sins, I only had him for a short time. I needed more time. And that is why your brother McGeesy never had children, and your cousin Fawn fled to the Rockies with her family. For the prophecies to come true, you had to make a deal with the Wintermaker. Is that it? Deal? No, it was never meant to be like that. The Omodai, a vessel. I only needed to provide him with a host so he could rise up from his slumber. Bait for my trap. For the Wintermaker to be defeated, he must rise from his tomb. Is there another way? Apparently, yes. Lily, listen to me carefully. You've been tricked. Someone else is using the tree. If you continue with this plan, you'll become the villain in this story. I was going to save my family. How? Levi mocked with a laugh. By using the Philosopher's Stone to uproot the Wintermaker from his tomb? You're about to nuke the whole thing. He lied to me. No, the Wintermaker knows if he is to rise and claim his victory over death, that he'll need the stars to align, which means he'll need the Omodai, the Song of the Manitou, and your water drum, along with the magic found in the Serpent Star. Your plan is his plan. But his servants, Lily protested, thinking of Chirani Basant, the witch upon the hill, and the faceless killer who'd preyed upon Lake Manitou since starting her house on fire. They are not here to help him rise. They are here to stop you. Stop me from doing what? I get it. I understand the choice you made. You chose Jean over your brother, your family, yet now you hold the Philosopher's Stone to do what? Destroy the world in order to get revenge for losing your husband? The Wintermaker doesn't want oblivion, which is what you're about to give the world. For better or worse, the prophecy must happen, which is why your future self sent me to stop you from breaking it today. Can I trust myself? Lily looked down at the Philosopher's Stone. She knew now how to fully unleash it. But it's not time for Ayash to battle the horned serpent. We haven't even reached the time of the 7 fires. What am I doing? What should I do? Stay the course. In the future, you and I are allies. You literally asked me to walk on water, and here I am on this frozen island. I'll go along with this plan of yours if you promise to trust the path you're on. The world is not coming to an end in 1962. Do you see the serpent star and the stars above? No. Do not attack the Wintermaker today. Put the Takpai to rest. Let the others do their part. You can't save all the summer birds. I'll wait for you in the future, and you'll close the last loop, and then I'll do the rest. When she hesitated, Levi gestured to the chaos around them. Now, put an end to this madness. Levi faded as Lily focused on the present, looking down at the powerful weapon she held in her hands. She could feel the malice and hatred within it, as if the stone wanted her to destroy the world. How do I let the Wintermaker get away with so many deaths? I deserve my revenge, don't I? Or am I the villain? She looked around the trap she'd stepped into. With the power of the Philosopher's Stone, she could toss aside the 2 Takpai attacking her precious Eddie. She could tear the limbs off the witch up on Bleeding Rock. She could rip into the foundations of Lake Manitou and pull the Wintermaker from his tomb. No, I will not be the villain, nor will I be the hero. I'll trust Levi and the others to finish the fight for me. I must trust what God has planned for me. She put away her thoughts of vengeance and followed another path into the future, a path where she did what Levi suggested. But the cost. An hour into the future, the crisis would be over, and by tomorrow, the floodwaters and the evil magic surrounding Lake Manitou would be washed away. But I cannot save all the summer birds. Lily took a final look at her loved ones, knowing the heartbreak she'd feel tomorrow. The frozen moment in time released. Lily rejected her villainous plan of vengeance and commanded the tornado of fire and water back over the island. Within the chaos, 10 Takpai swirled. Sleep, she told the enraged Takpai. Sleep. Water sprayed her face, but soon the swirl only held flame, and within the flame, the black spirits of the Takpai. The fire met the concrete, and instead of the Philosopher's Stone transforming lead into gold, she transformed fire, water, spirit, and concrete into a temporary prison for 10 of the Takpai. And now my heart must pay the price for my great blunder. Beside her, Wally Crane fell into the water, but quickly found his way back to her side. The trap would not claim his life. Chaos surrounded her, overwhelming her senses, but in the distance, she heard a voice shouting, "Get!" Her eyes turned to her favorite student, Eddie Nielsen, out on the lake facing the last 2 Takpai. "Get!" Eddie shouted. "Get off me!" Out of the corner of her eye, 2 dark creatures were tossed into the air, high above Lake Manitou, their confused, beady red eyes growing smaller and smaller. Eddie survived the attack. Nearer, she heard the whimpers of Cameron, the stern instructions of Nicole, and the calming affirmations of Gavin. But she kept her focus on sealing the Takpai in the concrete. For good measure, she pressed the slab down on one end of the concrete, which lifted the entire slab. It will buy us the time we need. Now, out of the floodwaters, Lily sat down on the high end of the slab. As Wally climbed back up to her side, Lily cradled the white egg on her lap. Her selfish heart swelled when she saw Cameron being lowered into the fishing boat along with Nicole and Gavin, who turned the boat to go collect Eddie from the overturned raft. "Is it over?" Wally asked from beside her. "No," she said, adding silently, "A terrible price must still be paid." Her eyes looked away from Bleeding Rock and the sawmill. for she already knew who would live and who would die. The waters receded, but the pain in her heart grew. "You saved me, Nokomis," Cameron declared as the nose of the fishing boat ground onto the sloping concrete. "But I could not save all my summer birds." "We need to get everybody warmed up or hypothermia will set in," Gavin said, taking charge. "There's a landing beneath the Forsberg house." He pointed to the lights of the farmhouse. "No one's home." Lily felt a different kind of chill creeping into her body. "But this is the terrible path I must take." As she climbed into the fishing boat, she put all her trust in the hands of Glenn Forsberg, Albert Fisher, and his grandson Chris. Chapter 63, The Grandfather Paradox, Fisher's Sawmill, March 20th, 1962. The two Takpai approached Grandpa Albert, who began to chuckle in agony. Part of Chris wanted to rush forward to attack, and the other part wanted to rush into the woods on the other side of Split Rock Creek. Face difficult situations even when you feel afraid. He could not run away, but rushing to his grandfather was also stupid. A scout must stay mentally awake. Think! The sound of metal echoed in his memory. Grandpa Albert slammed the last pin into place. The Takpai want the gates to fail. Chris rushed across the platform to the big wheel. His tired arms found a new life as the metal gate lifted from its closed position and the torrents of water was released. In doing so, he drew the attention of the Takpai. They seemed to rush to the edge of the water, but appeared afraid to cross some unseen barrier. As the gate reached the midpoint of its ascent, the spray of the water doubled and the creatures backed away. They're afraid of the rushing water. Chris remembered the story from the Bible about a horde of demons being afraid of getting cast into Lake Galilee by Jesus. If the Takpai are demons, they don't want to ever leave Lake Manitou. To his amazement, the gate began to appear above the surface of the water. Inch by inch, Chris became the hero who not only saved Nicky Guerin, but also the people of Split Rock. With 5 gates lifted and 5 gates still in place, the surge of floodwater would find 2 places of release without ripping out the safeguards. "I've done it, Grandpa. I've done it." As the gate fully lifted out of the water, the spray settled into the roaring waters of the creek, giving him a clear view across the lot. At the edge of the creek, 2 Takpai lifted something and threw it at Chris. The dark headlights should have been the first clue. The second clue should have been the fact that it was the green Renault. Last, just moments before it was too late, Chris saw that the car had no driver. What? Leaping away, Chris threw himself to safety as the nose of the car hit the wheel, crushing it. The current grabbed the tail of the car, pulling it down the creek where it smashed, rolled, twisted on its journey to the Crow Wing River. Chest on the dirt, Chris looked up to see a black figure inches in front of his face. He flinched, expecting death. Instead, the black eyes of a raven looked up back at him. Robin. The bird took flight, but instead of fleeing to the woods, it flew to the top of the sawmill and perched upon the edge of the roof. I'm supposed to follow it. An angry Takpai tossed a metal signpost at Chris like a javelin, missing him by just a few inches. Chris crawled to his feet and ran for the doors of the 3-story sawmill. No sooner had he stepped into the sawmill than the opposite door was ripped right off its hinges. What am I supposed to do? Fight them? Up, the raven called out. Up, up. Chris obeyed and clambered up the first set of stairs to the second floor. Of course, I can sneak away in the log flume. The path was blocked, but it wasn't the Takpai standing there. A man stood at the window, looking down at the creek. But the creek didn't belong to the present. Back at the deer stand, the dreamcatcher had shown him an alternate reality, which reminded Chris of a kaleidoscope. Now the world around him became wrapped in magic, and Chris heard the cause. A song. The song of the red-haired woman surrounding them filled the air. They're trying to change the past. Outside the window, Split Rock Creek flowed within its banks, with dozens of boulders visible. A boy in a blue jacket played near the edge of the shore. The boy stood abruptly, but not because he saw Chris peering down at the window. The boy in the blue jacket stood because Grandpa Albert was crawling across the parking lot toward him. He's still alive. Suddenly, the sawmill shook. In the present, the Tokpai took hold of the corner of the building, threatening to push it off its foundations. A dark image appeared in the window. The raven landed in the window. "Protect," it commanded. "I don't have a weapon. What am I supposed to protect?" Time slowed. The boy in the blue jacket took a step backwards. He was afraid of the old man crawling toward him. "Protect!" the raven screamed. Chris flinched, and so did the figure standing beside him. Chris studied him. "I know him from the old pictures hanging on walls." The strangely cut beard, the wild eyes. Feral Looning. Am I supposed to protect him? Chris reached into his pocket to retrieve Nicky's 2 pieces of cloth, with Lily's strange words written upon them. Of course I am. Only a jerk would protect himself. I need to protect the loop. I need to protect my grandfathers. "Ka-ri," Chris began, and then repeated, "Ka-ri-zip-por-ram." The building stopped shaking. The distant singing also stopped. Chris continued, singing syllable after syllable until the entire spell had been read. Then the past unfroze. The boy in the blue jacket fell into the creek. Grandpa Farrell clutched at his heart where the oak pendant hung from around his neck. In one fluid motion, he lifted his legs over the windowsill and dropped into the waters. The raven flew off, leaving Chris alone, peering down at a moment that had already happened decades earlier. Feral Looning should have died. Young Albert should have died. But in the roaring creek, they found each other. Feral Looning dragged the boy to the shore. The window to the past closed as the magic dissipated. "Grandpa!" Chris saw Grandpa Albert was inches away from the edge of Split Rock Creek, resting on his side. But then the entire building shook, and Chris was falling through the window. Before hitting the cold water, Chris found several small consolations in his manner of death. The Tokpai had killed him, yes, but not before he'd helped open the dam to save the others. Jimmy and Biff had saved a dozen, but he'd saved many more. He hoped Nicky Guerin would be impressed by his heroism. The next small consolation came when he realized he'd fallen into the waters of the creek rather than the lake. He would not be stuck in Lake Manitou for all eternity like the others. As his body entered the raging waters, he thought of how he'd defended the loop by protecting his 2 grandfathers as they, too, fell into Split Rock Creek. He hoped Robin would be pleased by this. Chris felt a rock crush his ribs, but the force of the blow lifted his body upwards, and for a brief moment, his hands grabbed hold on the top of the rock. He fought to hold on, but soon his entire body grew numb, and then his fingers slid free. "Take my hand," Grandpa Albert called out. Chris took the outstretched hand. He pulled his grandfather tight in an embrace, only to realize that they were both in the current of the river. But it was neither Split Rock Creek nor the Crowing River. It was something else entirely. "I'm glad you are with me, Grandpa." "So am I, Christopher. So am I." Chapter 64. Walpurgis. Old Copper Road, March 20th, 1962. Glenn Forsberg sat alone at the dining room table. Although a few hours late, the cows had now been milked, allowing him a few moments to process it all. He clasped his fingers together, set his elbows on the table, and rested his forehead against his knuckles. His knuckles still hurt. He lifted his head. The skin over the middle knuckle was ripped and was pulled over in a crust of blood. He hadn't noticed it while milking the cows, but now it throbbed. He'd punched his own vehicle rather than punch the sheriff deputy who told him access to Old Copper Road was closed. "I need to take care of my cows," Glenn had shouted, hitting the metal in frustration. Ultimately, they let him pass. Unlike the other bridges in the county, there were no pylons to catch the debris, but even without them, the angry water created a cloud of vapor as he passed through it to reach his farm. On the wall, he saw pictures of his family. He almost lost Brian today, and he'd already lost his oldest son, Paul, to meaningless arguments and petty issues. His wife and his daughter did their best to either obey or avoid him. Am I gruff or just a miserable human being? The answer came from a picture of his father, Bjorn. "You can't just sit on the fence," Bjorn had said to him years ago. "Yes, you can devote yourself to farming, but you also need to devote yourself to your family. The Forsberg family has a proud heritage, which means respecting the past as much as respecting the future. You have a choice to make. What will it be?" Glenn had rejected his father. Sure, he followed in his father's footsteps as a dairy farmer, but he rejected the rest. To make matters worse, he purposely courted and married Edna Haggard. Bjorn had driven him away from his duty to the Asante Lodge, and Glenn had driven away Paul to the Far East simply by being a hard man. Despite all of his efforts to lead a simple life, evil found its way to his doorsteps. And today I almost lost Brian. For the first time since he was a child, Glenn wept. Once the first tear came, he bawled, and after a few moments of weakness, he stuffed it all away and walked into the kitchen to find himself something to eat. At 7 o'clock, he waited by the clock and phone, but Edna didn't call. Something's wrong. Are the phone lines down? He checked and didn't find a dial tone. And here I sit, all alone. An hour passed. 2 hours passed. Glenn stood up from the kitchen and paced around his house. He wasn't ready to sleep, and he didn't want to hear the radio or watch the television. Instead, he put on his coat and went outside. After passing through the interior of the barn, he stepped out to the back pasture, where the cows had begun to bed down for the night. He watched his herd, one by one. He didn't draw any attention to himself, lest he confuse them by his unexpected appearance. He wasn't the only one watching the cattle go to sleep. A raven fluttered down from the trees to take a position atop the rear of the barn. Glenn gave it little thought as he tried to understand the world. A child predator had come all the way up from St. Louis and singled out his son, cutting a hole in the ice, acquiring chloroform, and then dragging a sled all the way to where he stood. It doesn't make any sense. If Brian had been alone, he might have been the third victim. Next, he tried to imagine what had happened with the bus today. Brian had gone from a bully of low character to a hero, risking his life to save the children trapped in the bus. I wish I could take credit, but I just sent him off to Haggard and ignored the problem. Albert Fisher tried to warn him of impending doom, but Glenn also ignored him. Albert reminded him too much of his father Bjorn, who had also talked like a fanatic about a war of good and evil. And here I sit on the fence. The raven left its perch, passing back to the trees, and just then a siren called out in the distance. It's coming from the lake? He started walking since his farmstead was built on the downslope of the granite bluff that separated the lake and the river. That's a siren all right, but it's not coming from St. John. It seems to... Something like a cannon shook the air. All the hair on his arm and neck stood on end, and he felt a chill that wasn't from the weather. "Protect," a voice in his mind called out. Glenn bolted back into the house, and in the mudroom, he found his Winchester 12-gauge shotgun and loaded 6 shells. He knew all the mumbo-jumbo about Bleeding Rock, and after the past few months, he wasn't taking any chances. He stepped out the door, a guardian. Back on the granite spine, he looked to the south. The lights were on in the McPherson house, and further down the hill, he saw lanterns on Old Copper Road near the scene of the bus accident. Did the investigators already arrive? The sound of a freight train rumbling down the tracks turned his attention to the north, and looking across Lake Manitou, he thought for a moment he saw the legendary Horned Serpent, only to realize it was a rise of floodwater entering the lake from the Blue Knife River. The Nicollet Dam. His breathing grew shallow and his heart started racing. Glenn took a few more steps north, imagining how a few more feet would cause Lake Manitou to spill its banks at several locations, including Split Rock Creek. If the dammed lagoon at the sawmill failed, it could flood the town. Is anyone there? He started to run. His trek took him toward the place where Isaac Larson died. The boy's death was first believed to be an accident and later attributed to Logan Troost. He stopped abruptly when he saw a fire burning atop Bleeding Rock. First, he saw the child. Having seen Brian and all the other children dealing with the effects of hypothermia, his mind went to a strange place. Did they miss one? But the child had not come from the bus, nor did he drown. Blood filled the channels in the rock. Next, Glenn saw the red-haired woman, wrapped in a blanket, sitting in the front of the fire. She sang strange syllables in the darkness, and even though Glenn didn't understand the language, he could feel she was evil. Then a figure moved. A gunshot filled the air, and simultaneously the bark on the nearby tree burst from the trunk, striking Glenn. He stepped back behind the tree as another bullet ripped into the woods. "Hey!" Glenn shouted out. "What do you think you're doing?" No explanation was given. "Shit!" Glenn flipped off the safety and slipped the barrel of the shotgun past the tree. He blindly fired before stepping out. Pumping a new shell into the chamber, he fired again and again. The man in the tweed jacket and derby hat grunted but did not go down, so Glenn fired again and again. The last 2 shots hit the man's left arm and gut, but the pistol remained in his hand. Glenn pumped the last shell into the chamber. The pistol rose, but not in Glenn's direction. It leveled at the young woman and fired into her forehead. Without thinking, Glenn blasted the man in the tweed jacket squarely in the chest, just below the collarbone. Son of a bitch. What the hell just happened? Something crashed closer to him from the old sawmill. Even though the shotgun was empty, he carried it with him as he ran. He arrived to see the entire mill lurch off its foundation and someone fall into the window from the window. Glenn ran, scrambling down the hill, across the empty parking lot, and toward Split Rock Creek. And at the edge of the creek, Glenn found the body of Albert Fisher. Chapter 65. The Jaws of Defeat. Old Copper Road, March 30th, 1962. Biff Forsberg hated funerals, but he kept his mouth shut and meekly got in the car for the 4th funeral of the week. His little sister Julia had to be physically prodded into the back seat by his mother, who practically lifted her by the arm on the way from the front door to the car. His father Glenn came from the edge of the feedlot and without a word slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and backed out. So that's how it's going to be with him? His father had always been a bit of a mystery, but now Biff no longer saw him as a father, but a figure to be feared. He dared not say a word about his discovery and sat in silence as they drove north. At the Doc Jenkins Bridge, Biff glanced south, able to see the path of destruction caused by the flood, where it mangled the lumber mill, but left the looning house still standing. Biff had no more tears. Chris Looning's body had been found a day after he died, and even though Biff read all about his buddy's heroism in the newspaper, it still didn't make any sense how he'd fallen into the waters of Split Rock Creek moments after saving the town from another dam failure. As the car drove up Market Street, Biff decided he would have gladly exchanged all of downtown and the dozens of old, lousy houses just to have his friend back. The washed-out section of road on the north end of town had been repaired, allowing the Forsberg car to pass right by the place where Chris had been killed. If the stories were to be believed, something struck the front of the sawmill, knocking the building off its foundations, and tossed Chris into the waters. Biff dreamed a dozen ways his friend had died, some filled with monsters and terror, and others with just a tragic slip of a shoe. Chris had been the fourth funeral. I never got to tell Chris I was sorry. Mount Olivet Cemetery, built on a hill that overlooked Lake Manitou, was just a mile from Split Rock. Filled with hundreds of gravestones, it had once been a place of wonder for Biff. Now he knew the stories of its 9 newest additions to the cemetery. The first funeral had been for Danica Knutson, who, along with the bus driver, Alan Whitrock, had been the first victims of the flood. The flood had also claimed the lives of Colin Kirkpatrick, Duncan Samuelson, and Red Doby, the men who had been killed when the dam collapsed. None of their bodies had been recovered. The second funeral had been for Uncle Ewan, who'd been killed trying to protect the quarry when the floodwaters cut through the road to claim a new bay on Lake Manitou. Uncle Ewan, along with Craig Healy, the man who'd caught Biff and Rory trespassing a lifetime ago, had been found floating in the Flotsam and Jetsam, right where Wally Crane confirmed they would be found. How do I trust any of these people ever again? A cast of familiar faces gathered for the fourth funeral. The Nielsen family, including a shaken Jimmy, already waited at the gravesite. 2 other families stood united by the tragedy, the Garons and the McPhersons. Neither Nicole nor Gavin seemed too keen to even acknowledge that they'd once gathered in the Asante Lodge, nor did they try to speak to Biff. When Wally arrived with his wife and daughters, they had an unexpected guest, Lily Garin, who came with a bundle of flowers. Biff could only clench his jaw in anger. He'd been left with so many questions that at times he felt like he was going to pass out, so he just focused on his breathing. The guests of honor all arrived together. Chris's older brother, Chuck, solemnly stood with his wife Helen and son Carson, who, despite a darker skin tone, looked just like Chris when they had been in elementary school. Marlon Looning and his wife Betsy emerged from their cars next, helping the grieving widow Eunice Fisher to the grave of her husband. Albert Fisher died of a heart attack, although some said it was a broken heart. He'd been found dead at the wreckage of the old sawmill, where he and Chris had managed to avert a crisis by removing enough floodgates to save the community. Biff kept his clenched hands in his front pockets while the funeral service began. You're all a bunch of liars. Business partners, including Sean Stewart and Morgan Marquette, stood in the same crowd as Wally Crane and Ed Nielsen. The heroes and villains all wore masks to hide themselves from the Hiawatha County community, but none more so than Biff's own parents. Edna Haggard Forsberg mourned the tragic death of her brother. Glenn Forsberg, wearing the mask of a dairy farmer, would shrug off the fourth funeral just as he'd done with the others, and then go back to his routine. Biff found himself studying his father the most. He now knew the villains in the story. Only Morgan Marquette had not lost any skin in the game, with Sean Stewart losing his son and Uncle Ewan losing his life. Biff had been there when Chirani Basant and William Olcott were invited to the quarry for a private tour. He'd also been there when he helped Molly Knutson and Jimmy Nielsen out of the water and into the tweed arms of William Olcott. Men, not monsters, brought death and mayhem to Hiawatha County. As Albert Fisher's coffin was lowered into the ground, Jimmy wept with the others, but Biff could only focus on his father's hand upon his shoulder. In that moment, he looked up, and his father nodded. He knows I know. Glenn had been waiting in the barn when Edna brought Biff back from the hospital and to the changed world of Lake Manitou. Under doctor's orders, Biff had been sent to bed, but by mid-afternoon, he received the news that they'd found Chris dead. Edna went to her kitchen, and Biff bolted to the woods. At Bleeding Rock, he'd found traces of blood. Standing at the cliff, he could see the devastation the Nicollet Dam had done to the lake. The overturned bus, the flooded quarry, the ruined cabins, the final nail in the coffin to Carousel Park, the displacement of the Guerin house and barn, and to the north, the crushed sawmill. Returning from his sojourn at Bleeding Rock, he looked down at the compost pile. A winter's worth of straw and cow manure piled up between the woods and the back door of the barn. The McPhersons would soon show up with a wagon to scatter the prize fertilizer upon their many fields. Yet, instead of a tight, high pile, it had been spread wide. The soil found along the slopes of Bleeding Rock did not allow for anything to be buried as deep as they were burying Albert at Mount Olivet, which is why Biff had found the bodies. The garden shovel, not the barn shovel, had been left leaning against one of the trees, proof of his father's involvement. Next to the manure pile, Biff found where dirt had been tossed, as well as some dried blood. Shoveling shit was one thing, but digging into rock and debris of Bleeding Rock was something that only a Forsberg understood. Glenn Forsberg had been exhausted when Biff returned from the hospital. The 3 graves explained why. After Uncle Ewan's funeral, and without the recovery of Red Dobie's body, Biff waited for the opportunity and then returned to the macabre scene. The garden shovel had been returned to the garage, and the compost pile now covered the 3 graves, but only by a few inches. By the 3rd day, Biff had to know, but his father still wore his dairy farmer mask, forcing his son to find the answers himself. So Biff dug. He didn't recognize the face of the boy, neither from Split Rock, St. John, or any local school. But he knew the face of William Olcott. He wore the tweed jacket, and with the blade of the shovel, Biff moved enough soil to be able to kneel down and check his pockets. His father had been hasty, leaving behind a custom-made Zippo with hood, striker, and fuel flask that slid out of its ornate sheath, which featured the Eye of Ra. He slid the lighter into his own pocket, replacing the soil. The 3rd person in the grave surprised him. He expected to find the body of Dobie. After all, the newspaper sold lies that he'd been claimed by the flood, one of the victims when the dam gave way. Some speculated that the boom following the sirens had been the men trying to clear debris with dynamite when something went wrong. Experts, however, found evidence that the dam breached and that the rumble had simply been the concrete giving way. Both theories took the lives of the 2 workers and Dobie. Now, looking around the crowd at Albert Fisher's funeral, Biff wondered which side told the lie. Did Triton want to wash its hand of its rabbit's dog? Or was it the Asante Lodge that dealt with Red Dobie? The garden shovel had created a new mystery for Biff to solve. Instead of the bearded face of Red Dobie, Biff found himself looking at a thing of beauty, the face of Sarah Oliventyar. Instead of seeing the glow of Nova Scotia firelight, her face was stained with soil, blood, and gore left from a shot to the forehead. Red Dobie and Sarah had been sitting at the same fire with him, and Biff wondered if one of the kids in Nova Scotia was now decomposing in an anonymous grave beside Sarah. All these thoughts filled his head as the funeral service concluded, with Lily Guerin setting flowers on Albert Fisher's grave. Biff's father steered him back to the car. Chapter 66. Until It Puckers. Old Copper Road, March 30th, 1962. For the first time since she was a girl, Lily Guerin could see the boulders at the bottom of the Blue Knife River. Although the foundation of the Nicollet Dam remained farther downstream, the reservoir had been emptied over the past few days, returning to what it had been decades earlier. Her escort, Wally Crane, patiently waited at her side. Both had come from the funeral of Albert Fisher, aware that the fight was not yet over. At least the immediate future was now set. In 24 years, at the age of 103, Lily would close a loop in time just as the power of the Serpent Star returned, and usher in the era of the Seventh Fire. Tonight will be the last night I spend near Lake Manitou, she told Wally. Wally gazed down at the exposed riverbed and nodded. I understand. Do you? The only one who truly understood her plan stoked a cold fire in the distance. Her warriors in the Asante Lodge had rallied. 2 had made the ultimate sacrifice to keep the path to victory alive. A younger generation had joined the fight, while older members like Eddie Nielsen and Glenn Forsberg found themselves guided by fate. Decades earlier, her beloved cousin Fawn abandoned her when she learned about the price Lily had paid for the life of Jean Guerin. Was a decade of love worth 5 decades of loneliness? Lily had no other choice. The blood in her veins had the capacity to destroy the Wintermaker's plans. But like the legend of Ayash and the Horned Serpent, she needed to appear weak and desperate for the monster to expose himself to danger. In just a few short years, she would have her revenge against the monster of Lake Manitou. Until then, I must say goodbye to my brother, Lily said. I'll go wait in the truck. No, she said softly. Come back in the morning. There is much my brother and I must discuss. Wally turned, and Lily began walking toward her brother. McGeesy was passing his sweat lodge. The coals had turned to ash in his fire pit, and the sun on the spring day provided its own warmth. He dropped a handful of dry kindling and with some smaller sticks pressed it into the coals. When smoke began to appear, he piled the sticks on top and then set 3 smaller logs in a pyramid above the warming fire. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me, McGeesy said. I had to attend another funeral. You do understand it won't be the last. It will be the last for a while. Do you really think so? McGeesy asked. I do. Our enemies are divided, and the damage done will force them to wait for the return of the Serpent Star. We must be ready. So you're going to abandon me again. Do you still plan to run off to Leech Lake? Lily went to put a hand on her brother's shoulder, but he quickly moved to avoid it. I'm not abandoning you. For better or worse, the choices in my life have set us on this path. It's not safe for me to linger here. This time, McGeesy did not argue. The past few days had brought the two of them together, and the more he understood the enemy, the more he understood the horrible choice she'd made so long ago. At least he doesn't see me as an enemy. But McGeesy still viewed her as a necessary evil. It will take a few moments for the fire to warm the stones. Come, sit with me on the porch, and tell me what I must do in the coming days. Once situated on the porch, they prepared for war. The ranks of the Asante Lodge needed to be restored. With the passing of both Albert and Chris, and the abject failure of Marlon Looning, the heirs would be Chuck Looning and his boy Carson. Convincing them to return from banishment in Georgia would be a tricky affair. With Wally Crane as leader and mentor, both Brian Forsberg and Jimmy Nielsen would be groomed for the future. Both would be men in 1986 when the Serpent Star returned. McGeesy chuckled, interrupting Lily. The silver lining in you moving to Leech Lake is that Leonard White Elk might be willing to visit more often. I wish I could have made Fawn understand. McGeesy scoffed. She understood your choices. She just thought you were a monster for making them. I'll explain what happened to Leonard and try to convince him how much we need Benjamin to strengthen our ranks. I worry about Nicole, Lily finally admitted. Having seen the horrors on Carousel Island, Nicole reacted without any acknowledgement of the incident. While Cameron went into a complete shock, Nicole pretended as if nothing had happened. I worry she will turn the next generation against me. We might need to find a priest to guide us. You said that was my role. Yes, but you are a priest of Manabozho. There are several prophecies at work, and if the Asante Lodge will need the guidance of a priest with a Christian perspective, Nicole will need his counsel to understand her part in this. Instead of arguing, McGeesy nodded. Well, that's a first. For almost an hour, the two of them sat together on the porch, reflecting. The stones in the yard continued to heat. McGeesy finally stood, went inside, and returned with food and drink. You'll need your strength, he told her. Lily wondered if it was best to continue on an empty stomach, but McGeesy had finally caught his herring, and she would do what she had to do. As a boy, her brother would stand upon boulders in the channel of the Blue Knife, waiting for river monsters to swim by. Although he was now in his 70s, he led an active, living off his small patch of land life. When Lily arrived a week ago, with Nicole and Gavin to obtain the Philosopher's Stone, her brother already stood vigil as the warrior he never got to be. So it came as no surprise that he caught a mighty fish in his net that night. Lily drank as much of the soup as she could and then stood. McGeesy took the signal and quickly finished, and together they walked into the sweat lodge. She found the dying man within. Unlike a traditional Anishinaabe sweat lodge, which was constructed with ritualistic purpose, this lodge had a darker purpose. The fire pit at the center had almost grown cold. The head of their prisoner lifted. I remember your father, Lily said to him. She found her spot beside the fire, sitting on the ground beside the living head. My beloved Jean told me all about his fears of the Order of Eos, but as a girl, I could only see the internal threats of my Ouijigan blood. After all, Joseph Littletoad believed he was fulfilling his religious duty when he offered my brother as a host for the Wintermaker. The old pain had cooled compared to the hatred she felt for the man who brought so much death back to Lake Manitou. But she calmed her rage along with her moral misgivings. I need to understand my enemy. What did you call the Wintermaker again? A whimper preceded the two raspy syllables. Surtur. Yes, a monster with many names. Your father Halvar understood the delicate nature of prophecy. When he learned about the heretic Joseph Littletoad, he found common cause. He rode out onto the campus of our new school, removed the mask he wore, and revealed to my husband what was happening. You see, he understood, even as a servant of the Wintermaker, that the prophecy would not be fulfilled until its proper time. Yet his own son almost destroyed everything because of jealousy and fear. McGeesee threw open the flap and light beamed into the darkness and onto the face of Red Dobie, who was buried up to his chin in solid stone. Dobie groaned when he saw the heated stones. Lily now understood better than any law officer what happened. She and McGeesee understood more than the Grand Master of the Order of Eos, young Rosdell Hutt, could guess. Under slow torture for the past few days, Dobie gave them all the information they needed about their elusive enemy. A civil war broke out within both the Order of Eos and Triton Corporation, between the elder Alistair Sinclair and the young Ross Delhut. A generation earlier, the Sinclair family sent Halvar Dobie to Hiawatha County to not only manage the Nicollet Dam, but also to spy on the actions of the American branch of Triton. The role of embedded spy passed on to his son Red, who grew up with the other Order of Eos members like Ewan Haggard, Morgan Marquette, and Sean Stewart. Unlike the American businessmen, the Sinclairs were deeply religious men, worshiping the old gods. After consultation with his Finnish witches, who could still sing the old songs, Alistair Sinclair sent Dobie on a mission to make contact with the sleeping god beneath Lake Manitou. So Red began by trying to murder Lily Guerin. In the dead of night, he doused her home with gasoline and lit the flames with his Bic lighter. By the time the flames were discovered, he'd safely jogged to anonymity. With Lily out of the way, Dobie prepared for the coming of Sarah Olavantiar. To do this, he needed to sacrifice lives so that death magic could awaken the spirits of the sleeping giants, as he called them. It began with the sabotage of Carousel Island, which only gave Red 4 deaths. But it woke 4 dark spirits. After that, the spirits that Lily knew as the Takpai began adding to the count. The unexpected twist had been the Forsberg boy. From meeting Chirani Basant to sneaking into the quarry with the Stewart boy, Forsberg became a security risk. Dobie abducted and killed the Stewart boy first, yet failed to nab the Forsberg boy while his father was away from home. To deflect blame, Dobie found a patsy, sacrificing Logan Troost and letting him take the blame for the 3 deaths. But to Lily's surprise, Dobie's plan was not to resurrect the Wintermaker, like Joseph Littletoad had attempted in 1898. No, Red's plan was to provide enough death so that Sarah Olavantiar could reach back through time to destroy the roots of Lily's story. To do this, Dobie needed more than just a dozen deaths. He needed a disaster. On his vigil along the Blue Knife River, McGeesee caught Dobie jogging back to his farm near Nimrod. Now, McGeesee sat down beside his prize and looked to his sister. It's time to sing. At this, Dobie let out a long groan. Does my singing bother you? Lily asked. For years, I thought the men of the dawn might just be an imagined enemy. I questioned my mind. I questioned my dream. All I wanted to do was protect my children, and it turned out you were the devoted servant of the Wintermaker. The blood of children is on your hand. Now, we need to understand the rest. McGeesee leaned in. In the days of old, prisoners were slowly roasted alive so they could divulge the secrets of our enemies. Those who cooperated were given a quick death, but those who withheld were kept alive for days, just like you. All of this torture we put you through has troubled my tender-hearted sister. Tell us what we need, and I promise you, I'll give you a quick death tonight. Dobie groaned again. Although Lily could only see his head, she knew why he suffered. Using the power of the Philosopher's Stone, She'd manipulated the solid stone to swallow his body up to his chin. Under his feet, the philosopher's stone provided a flame that could hurt or heal upon her command. I don't need to hear any more stories or tales about the Order of Eos, Lily began. I've heard plenty about the plans of your masters. I need to hear about your enemy. My enemy? Dobie asked. You've been tricked, Lily said. I need you to tell me everything you know about Chirani Basant and what you told him about the Wintermaker. Basant is a nobody. Is he? Lily asked. What is the saying? Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. I know the men of the Dawn. I've lived beside them my whole life. Yet behind the face of death was the face of Chirani Basant. I've already explained this, Dobie whimpered. Alistair Sinclair hired him and sent him off to Yale to act as a spy for young Ross Delhut. He orchestrated everything that happened here at Lake Manitou over the past year, but he was Sinclair's man. Like you, McGeesy added. Dobie nodded. Oh, I'm sure Alistair Sinclair is a proper villain, but we'll have to deal with in good time. But I don't understand what a scholar like Basant gets out of all of this. If he was your ally, why wasn't he with the others at Bleeding Rock? What? Lily saw a cold hate in her brother's eyes as he bent low to intimidate Dobie. If successful, Sinclair's sorceress would have destroyed the town of Split Rock and, in doing so, sent enough magic back to 1898 to change the course of time. It was a bold plan. Lily felt emboldened too. They failed, and the flow of destiny continues toward the ultimate defeat of your god. I'll be there to laugh at him when his soul descends where it belongs in the abyss. But Chirani Basant was not with them. Dobie's eyes could not hide his concern. Take me back to the quarry, Lily said. Right after you shot you and Haggard and his security guard, what did Chirani Basant do? My God is real, Dobie protested. I hope you live long enough to see him rise, for he'll kill everyone you love before killing you and restoring the world to the way it once was. McGeesy's eyes widened. Each of us assumes our faith is right, even my brother. Time will tell. Why did you take him to the quarry? McGeesy pressed. To show him our God was real, Dobie insisted. Where is the archaeology to prove Christ ever walked on the earth? Where is the archaeology to prove Manabozho ever walked the earth? My God is real. We found him buried under Lake Manitou. Lily felt her heart flutter. Did you let Basant take him? Of course not. The quarry is hallowed ground to us, and what's under Lake Manitou even more so. He only wanted to visit the tomb. He only wanted proof. Did you accompany him the entire time? No, but after he returned, he didn't have anything. I saw. Blowing the dam had two purposes. Sinclair didn't want to risk Delhut doing something stupid, so the destruction of the Nicollet Dam locked the door to our discovery. Then why did Basant flee at Sinclair's moment of victory? According to what Wally learned, Basant fled the country by private plane out of Brainerd. Dobie moaned. He won't last much longer. Answer this. How did Sinclair's witch know the Song of the Manitou? Dobie doubled down, finding inner strength to stare back at her defiantly. Like I said, our God is real. She learned the secrets the same way Odin learned them. The roots of Leyrod betrayed you. Of course, the old willow is at the heart of everything. Lily nodded to McGeesy, stood up, and left Red Dobie to her brother. On the opposite shore of Lake Manitou, tucked into GB Hollow, the old willow waited. Postlude. Dearly departed. Upper Hay Lake, Minnesota, June 5th, 2029. The Raven waited in a basswood tree outside the cabin for Robin Berg. The adults had gotten wasted the previous night, and outside the sliding glass door, the signs of their debauchery could still be seen. Alcohol, drugs, destruction, filth, and for a change, fireworks. Spent canisters, charged science experiments, and tiny shreds of paper littered the backyard that faced the lake. The party lasted most of the night, which meant nobody was waking up until at least noon. Robin looked back into the suspended chaos of the cabin, and with her canvas Attack on Titan backpack over her shoulder, quietly closed the sliding glass doors behind her. The Raven lifted from the tree and flew west. She ignored the paradox that was Upper Hay Lake and took the side stairs off the deck. There, parked in the narrow space between garages, she found the ATV the boys had used the previous night. There was still 2/3 a tank of gas remaining, and according to her smartphone, she was only 30 miles away from her answers. Oh, fuck it. What's the worst they can do to me? She fired up the ATV, waited for a moment, and then slowly drove away. Her trip took her across Highway 371, which she knew, and into Cass County, which was all wrong, along a series of paved county roads. The closer she got to Lake Manitou, the thicker the pine forest grew. At 110th Avenue, 60th Street turned into Wadena County Road 7, which was all wrong. Having visited Lake Manitou countless times, she kept the ATV going, but when she turned south, her heart sank. The town of Split Rock was gone. The entire valley was gone. What happened? At the intersection of Highway 7 and Highway 9, where two small county roads converged, Google Maps proudly declared the location to be Oilen, which Wikipedia claimed to be an unincorporated town that didn't even list a population despite a handful of buildings. Even a catastrophic flood, like the one in the spring of 1962, would have left twisted steel and broken foundations. Instead, the river flowed over stone and sand as it passed south to distant Crow Wing State Park. Something far worse than a flood did this. She parked the ATV on the shoulder and hopped off. Placing her hands on the railing of the bridge, she let her mind return to the dreams of Chris and Grandpa Albert. The mansion made from bricks from the old nunnery should have been along the eastern hill overlooking the river. Gone. Both tributaries, Split Rock Creek on the north side of town and Canaransee Creek on the south side of town, non-existent. As real as it was with its sounds and smells, the Crow Wing River was also half a mile too far east. They both died for nothing. Robin felt as if Albert's death was sad but poetic. As a boy, he'd almost died in the roaring waters of Split Rock Creek, and decades later, it felt like closure to have him return to the same place, this time as a hero. But poor Christopher. Robin felt tears streaking down her cheeks, and even after wiping them away with the back of her hand, they still blurred her vision. She let go of the bridge railing and took a few steps west, toward where Split Rock Creek was supposed to be. What did I learn? The loop needed to be closed. The Wintermaker had found a way to communicate to his servants, speaking through one of the roots of the tree from the future to be heard in the past. He chose to attack in 1962 with the help of Red Dobie, first waking the Tokpai and then sending the witch. Their plan had been to use the Nicolet Dam to send a wall of water to give Sarah Olavantiar enough death magic to stop Lily. When Albert's heart gave out, Chris gave his life to prevent the town from being swept away. No, weren't you paying attention? Robin ripped her backpack off, unzipped it, and went to the back pages of her dream journal, where she listed all the heroes and villains. Uncle Ewan and Ross Delhut were villains listed under the heading Order of Eos. These were the bastards digging up the Wintermaker and searching for the Philosopher's Stone. These guys wanted to resurrect a buried god in order to return the world to some Nordic Midgard where they would rule as jarls. Back in 1898, Eos tried to steal all of the Blue Knife River Valley from Lily's family through violence and political maneuvering. Villains. Yet Rory Stewart died. Uncle Ewan died. Haggard Quarry was flooded. The Nicollet Dam was flooded. Eos got its ass kicked. By whom? Team Red Thunderbird. Biff noticed. Wally did too. Red Dobie might have been born into Eos, but there was some civil war happening within the secret society involving Alistair Sinclair and Finnish witches, and Chirani Besant. In all the chaos of storms, floods, bus accidents, Tokpai, and Lily Guerin almost ripping the world apart to save her summer birds, Robin almost forgot about the non-Indian Indian Chirani Besant. Where the fuck did he come from? And where the fuck did he go? The raven craw caught in her ear. It sat on a dead oak tree on the western shore of the Crow Wing River, staring down at her. Ahead of her, County Road 9 was lined with thin birch trees and an ATV trail. Further up the gentle slope, birch trees transitioned to taller pines. Am I insane? Did I dream it all? It has to be real. Robin stopped and turned around, but not in defeat. Instead, she turned her ATV. The gas tank neared half full, meaning she still had another 50 miles before she stranded herself in the sticks of Wadena County. If I run out of gas, I'll just walk back to the cabin. She throttled the engine and steered it up the hill, west. A half-mile from the asphalt road, she came to an intersection with roads leading north and south. To the south, she saw the Crow Wing River bend back west, about where Albert Fisher's sawmill should be located. To the north, on a road labeled Wilderness Drive, she saw a mile of straight open road, which she took. 7 miles south of Nimrod, the terrain was entirely desolate. There were no houses or farms, and even the once majestic forests had been turned into empty fields of grass and shrub with pockets of new growth woods. Yet, after a mile of nothing, Wilderness Drive bent to the northeast. The reason? A bend in the Crow Wing River. Robin could see it from the road, just a few feet below the surface of the county road. A load of rock and gravel dumped from the road could plug the river, she realized, backing it up and sending it over its banks. Time is like a river, McGeesy had once said. Could time be changed as easily as a river channel? Robin again slipped off her old Attack on Titan backpack. In the old anime series, the characters lived in an inverted world of Earth, with Africa pointing north to Antarctica. Is that what this is? Does Hiawatha County exist under my feet? Could I dig a hole to reach it? My shrink would love to find out how far down I'd dig before admitting the truth. Her pencil drawing of the town of Split Rock showed the Crow Wing River passing through town at a slight southwest angle before making a big bend near the Fisher lumber mill, where they were sandbagging. After passing by Doc Jenkins Bridge, it curved back to its current channel near Bullard Bluff. Wilderness Drive is Market Street, which means... Robin spun the ATV around, throttling the engine without any care for gas mileage. At the intersection of County Road 9, she made a sharp turn west, picturing Lily Weber walking to town from the reservation. A gravel road diverged from the highway, allowing Robin to turn where Split Rock Creek should have been. Once again, thick brush grew where the old sawmill should have been, and as the ATV passed the only thing close to a roaring creek was a couple of swampy ponds, and Robin gasped and squeezed the brakes. In the midst of the unkept growth, a grassy patch no bigger than a front yard grew, and a white skull peeked through the soil. It was too big to be a real skull, and as she approached, she realized the rock formation was also too irregular to be an oversized sculpture either. The stone formation was natural, yet she slid off the ATV and approached it cautiously. As she walked around it, she could see that it was a massive rock, buried by the sediment of Wadena County. Finally, she had the confidence to climb up onto it, taking off her backpack and sitting atop the stone alone. With her eyes open, she remained in the wilderness of Wadena County, but when she closed them, she could see Hiawatha County. Tall green pines ringed the shores of the blue lake, and beneath where she sat, pieces of the boulder were strewn in the passage of Split Rock Creek. Split Rock. The rock she sat upon was whole, blocking any rainfall or precipitation from flowing to nearby Crowing River. Instead, the water seeped slowly through the sediment and into the sandy aquifer below the surface. Robin opened her eyes to a world where everything had been destroyed. Lake Manitou, Hiawatha County, and every living member of Lily Guerin's family. A few months back, the raven had brought her to the women in the willow, who told Robin that she was the one who could help defeat the Wintermaker, if she trusted them. But all the facts led her to believe that the Asani Lodge had been the ones defeated. How do I fix this? Who did this to Hiawatha County? Or am I just crazy? Robin picked up her yellow backpack and climbed back on her ATV to head back to the cabin. But I can risk a few more miles first. Under County Road 9, she knew Lake Manitou existed, even if Split Rock and St. John were nowhere to be found. The Blue Knife River didn't flow south from Nimrod, but she stopped where the Nicollet Dam was supposed to be. There, instead of finding Turtle Island State Park, she found a little sign, West Lyons Cemetery. She pulled off the road, driving along the edge of the cemetery where a few hundred gravestones stood. None of them held any of the names from her dreams. Frustrated, her eyes again began to fill with tears, and instead of mourning the deaths of Albert and Chris, she mourned for all of them. And if her dreams were right, for the unknowing world she lived in. Pulling back onto the road, she continued south for home. She throttled her ATV and flew it down the road as fast as a car. She'd gone less than a mile, about the width of Lake Manitou, when she found something on the road. The black raven stood in the middle of the highway, looking right at her. Robin squeezed the brakes and shut off the engine. Its beady eyes studied her for a moment, tilting its head in curiosity. It shivered, fluffing its feathers, before croaking out a single syllable in English. Trick. And then it flew off. This is the end of the Wintermaker. The Dreamcatcher Chronicles will continue with Book 3, The Trickster.